Hello, everyone, and welcome to our monthly webinar series for the Park Service's Connected Conservation Initiative, which was formerly known as Scaling Up. My name is Brian Fainer, and I'm with the Park Service and help support the effort. Our Connected Conservation webinars focus on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to conserve Park Service resources at the landscape seascape level. We host a webinar at least once a month. In this case, this is the second for the month. And you can find recordings of past webinars in our internal Connected Conservation Toolkit and the Network for Landscape Conservation website. And both of those links have been entered into the chat box. So I encourage you all to explore those resources. We will be posting this webinar following our presentation today. And throughout the presentation, feel free to plug in any questions that you have into the questions box. And following the presentation, we'll read aloud those questions and then open up the phone lines for additional questions as well. And today's presenter is Catherine Doyle-Kapman, who is a doctoral candidate finishing her degree in Human Dimensions of Natural Resource Management in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell University. She also is a visiting scholar in the Division of Mammals at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. Catherine has worked in wildlife and natural resource conservation throughout her professional career for organizations including the Wildlife Conservation Society, the American Museum of Natural History, the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History, and the Eco Health Alliance. So with that, Catherine, thanks for presenting, and the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you guys so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. Just a bit about my research. My dissertation research seeks to understand how to avoid planning implementation gaps in large landscape conservation initiatives, such that we can promote the efficiency and effectiveness of our conservation planning efforts. My research is funded by the Human Dimensions branch of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I've been working with the Fish and Wildlife Service throughout my graduate career. So as we know, a collaborative landscape level approach to natural resource conservation has been increasingly adopted over the last 30 years. Examples of these initiatives include migratory bird joint ventures, NRCS's landscape level initiatives, landscape conservation cooperatives, and of course NPS programs such as national heritage areas. These collaborative landscape conservation initiatives are partnership-based and rely on a decentralized co-governance model where decision-making power is shared amongst a variety of organizations and agencies. Despite its potential advantages, this conservation model faces inherent challenges. Primary among these is the question of how to ensure ecosystem-wide goals for conservation and landscape planning products such as environmental assessments and decision support tools will be adopted into local management plans and subsequent management actions in such a way that landscape level goals are achieved through local practice. Within the United States and in most parts of the world, landscapes targeted for conservation contain heterogeneous mosaics of land use and ownership. Developing socio-politically feasible and technically achievable conservation goals within these complex social ecological landscapes requires coordination and collaboration between stakeholders at various institutional and geographic levels. Particularly important to engage in landscape conservation planning processes are local stakeholders. Local stakeholders are organizations, networks, and individuals who operate at the ground level where resource planning and management and use occur, have vested interest in the management of resources targeted for conservation, and have the power, such as political power, social influence, and control over resource management, to support or impede implementation of conservation promoting management actions. A particularly important local stakeholder group to engage in landscape conservation planning are the end users of landscape planning products. End users are individuals or representatives of groups or agencies that influence, develop, or implement land and resource management plans and may use collaborative landscape conservation planning products to inform their plans and management actions. End users are thus the stakeholder group that may in many ways determine whether landscape conservation goals will be achieved through local management practices. While the landscape conservation community recognizes and values the role of local stakeholders in landscape conservation planning, local stakeholder engagement and social data integration have not yet been institutionalized in collaborative landscape conservation planning efforts. This condition persists in part because landscape conservation partners are unsure of what, when, and where stakeholder input derived from social data and public engagement will be most valuable during conservation planning, and how they could be most effectively incorporated. Ultimately, this condition is problematic, as failing to include local stakeholders in landscape conservation decisions creates the opportunity for what have been termed problems of fit. These are mismatches between the interests, needs, knowledge, and capacities of those developing landscape conservation goals and planning products, and those of end users responsible for planning and implementing management actions. In worst-case scenarios, problems of fit can lead to planning implementation gaps, where landscape conservation goals and planning products are developed, but due to lack of local support or relevancy, they are not used to inform management planning. My research seeks to help conservation partners avoid problems of fit and subsequent planning implementation gaps by providing insight into how local stakeholders might be most effectively and efficiently engaged in landscape conservation planning. More specifically, my driving research question is, when, where, and through what mechanisms can the values, interests, and resources of local stakeholders be most effectively integrated into landscape conservation planning processes? To address this question, I conducted a multi-stage social science analysis during my dissertation research. This included a literature review to gather insights into lessons, strategies, and caveats related to local stakeholder engagement within a variety of landscape conservation efforts. Next, I conducted scoping interviews with the coordinators of 33 large landscape initiatives throughout the United States to understand how local stakeholder engagement and social data has informed decision-making in these processes. Finally, I conducted a multi-case study analysis of 3 landscape conservation design efforts, which are the collaborative landscape conservation planning approach adopted by most of North America's landscape conservation cooperatives. Case study analysis involved interviews with a total of 115 individuals across 3 LCD efforts, including 55 development team members, 50 potential and current end users of conservation design products, and 10 coordinators of alternative landscape conservation design initiatives. You can see on the table on the right the range of the types of end users I interviewed. One of the primary products resulting from this inquiry is a peer-reviewed practitioner's guide for local stakeholder participation in collaborative landscape conservation planning. This guide, which will be available in July of 2018, provides insight into local stakeholders' preferences for participating in collaborative landscape conservation planning, challenges associated with lack of stakeholder participation in these planning processes, best practice guidance for facilitating local stakeholders and especially end users' participation during distinct stages of the conservation planning process, and guidance on collecting primary and secondary social data that might inform landscape conservation decision-making. Today, I would like to spend the rest of our time reviewing highlights of the best practice guidance we present in our practitioner's guide. In order to provide best practice guidance for local stakeholder participation and human dimensions thinking during collaborative landscape conservation planning, in the guide we broke down the process into 6 general stages and provided the best practice guidance related to each of these stages. Given our time limits today, I won't go into guidance related to each of these stages. Instead, I'll provide an overview of best practice guidance. So first of all, collaborative landscape conservation involves a series of processes intended to both generate conservation-supporting products and foster a community of practice, focusing on the development of interpersonal bonds and a foundation of trust between and among development team members and local stakeholders can be essential to maintaining partnerships and stable networks of collaborators. Hosting in-person participation events and not allowing external pressures to accelerate the pace of planning can really promote the development of these trusting relationships. These relationships are really integral to forming stable networks of collaborators. And so ultimately, they're not only important during conservation planning, but they also are extremely important when it comes to management implementation and to our capacity as a conservation community to iteratively revise and adapt our planning efforts. Fostering local stakeholder participation and social data consideration during landscape conservation planning requires leadership by individuals who value, respect, and seek diverse perspectives and different sources of knowledge during decision-making. It also requires participation by folks who have experience with social data collection, potentially, or stakeholder engagement. And these aren't necessarily always skills that folks in the natural resource management community possess. So it's really important to determine whether it's necessary to contract somebody with these needed skills and have them on hand or on staff in order to really maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of stakeholder engagement processes. And maximizing that effectiveness and efficiency is really important because local stakeholders can start to experience participation fatigue if they're contacted too frequently, or if they are asked to be involved in planning that doesn't seem to really have a purpose. So really working to try to get experts that have experience with stakeholder engagement can be really instrumental. From a perspective of the Landscape Conservation Planning Initiative, constructing development teams that include trusted representatives of local stakeholders to ensure that the interests and values of these stakeholders are incorporated or at least considered throughout planning is also really important. And these trusted representatives can be, in some ways, identified through processes such as social network analysis, where you find major nodes in networks of communities of practice. But it also, these representatives should also be determined based on consultation with the local stakeholders to ensure that the representatives that are chosen to participate on development teams and in landscape planning are actually representing the interests and values of the stakeholders that you're seeking to engage and represent. Ensuring a diversity of local stakeholders' interests can be represented during landscape planning starts with having a broad planning purpose. This is the reason for why the Landscape Initiative is coming together and why people are being brought together to plan collaboratively and make decisions. Ideally, a landscape conservation initiative purpose is broad enough to allow flexibility in defining the specific goals of the planning effort, identifying conservation targets, and determining process outcomes. Development teams that try not to tightly constrain the purpose or the outcomes of conservation planning are much more successful at representing the interests and attracting a diversity of local stakeholders. So just to give you an example, in one of the case studies that I examined, which was looking at coastal wetlands in the Great Lakes, municipal planners didn't feel that they were municipal planners didn't really feel that they were important contributors to the planning process because they lived in urbanized areas with hardened seashores and shorelines. But the reality is that those shorelines can in times be converted back to wetlands. And so they would have been really important representatives or stakeholders to represent on these decision processes. But because of the planning purpose, they felt potentially that their interests weren't going to be represented and there wasn't much point in their participation. So really trying to avoid conditions where just the basic purpose of an initiative alienates potential stakeholders of relevance is really important. The effectiveness of participation opportunities can be improved by consulting with local stakeholders about their preferences for participation and addressing barriers to their participation, such as financial and logistical barriers. Some folks that I talked to said that, they would be willing to participate and come to meetings, but it just happened that, they always took place during business hours and they couldn't attend meetings, or it always took place oftentimes during construction seasons and they couldn't attend those meetings. So really consulting with your important end users and your local stakeholders regarding what their preferences might be can be really instrumental to ensuring that they can participate effectively. The potential end users of collaborative landscape conservation planning products are particularly important local stakeholders to engage in planning. Developing sociopolitically feasible, supported conservation goals and useful planning products is contingent on considering the needs and interests of these stakeholders. Conducting needs assessments that identify local stakeholders, and especially as end users, priorities and their needs to achieve their own priorities within a broad landscape can be a great way to better understand what types of planning products would likely be used and would be useful to end users, and therefore increase the likelihood that these products would be adopted into local management plans. My research indicates that local stakeholders are more willing to participate in planning efforts and support conservation actions if the targeted landscape has meaning and importance to them, meaning that they have a sense of place, a sense of identity, it's a functional dependency on the place. So if ecological drivers require that the targeted landscape extend beyond the boundary of areas valued by or which have meaning to local stakeholders, establishing socially meaningful subgeographies where these local stakeholders can engage in decision making and they act as focal areas can be really advantageous This can also reduce the burden on local stakeholders who might have to travel really far if you only have a single centralized location where in-person participation events may occur. If you have more participation events in smaller, associated with smaller areas, you can then potentially, as a development team, aggregate these products, the decisions up and make sure that you can actually apply them to the broader landscape, but that local stakeholders are engaging at a landscape level or at a geographic level that has importance and meaning to them. Targeted communications can potentially increase the likelihood end users adopt planning products by highlighting, for example, how the planning products may have relevance to them and their organizations, how the products address current gaps in capacity, and how the products might help potential end users achieve their personal or organizational goals. Peer-to-peer learning through demonstration sites and testimonials can also increase end users' trust of planning products and illustrate how these products have been and might be used. Finally, planning products and landscape planning processes need to be iteratively adapted over time to address end users' feedback on planning products and processes, the evolving needs of end users and other local stakeholders, and changing social and ecological conditions within the landscape. Refining planning processes and products adaptively requires consistent access to development teams and local stakeholders who are willing and able to participate iteratively in planning efforts. A strong focus on relationship and trust building and the capacity to demonstrate the collaborative landscape initiatives are actually informing local management plans can really help sustain long-term relationships and reduce the unwillingness to participate in these relationships that come along with, the onus of transactional costs. So really focusing on trying to build these relationships to ensure capacity for adaptation is really essential. So that was just a brief overview of the types of recommendations we present in our guide. The guide, as I mentioned, will be available in July. It's an 8-chapter guide. It was peer-reviewed by we had a practitioner contact team who reviewed it and helped development. We also had 30 coordinators of landscape initiative who reviewed it. So it's a peer-reviewed guide. And the guide really helps the intended purpose of the guide is really to help reduce the incidence of planning implementation gaps in collaborative landscape conservation and help ensure landscape conservation efforts follow good environmental governance practices, such as inclusivity, fairness, accountability, things that we should all be striving for as a community of practice. And also, it's really intended to help sustain the landscape conservation model and make it the most feasible and functional as it possibly can be. So in closing, I would like to thank a variety of people, my funders especially, and our contact teams and the folks at Cornell who have always really supported and helped me through my research and development of this guide. And with that, I'd like to turn it over and solicit any questions and be involved in any conversation that may come up.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Great presentation. Again, folks, if you have questions for Catherine, or if you want to plug them into the questions tab, we're going to take a look at those now. Otherwise, if you want to hold on, we'll open up the phone lines in a bit too, and then you can ask your question directly to Catherine that way as well. All right, so Catherine, what again were the 6 steps, I guess, for that you referenced?
Yeah, absolutely. So these 6 steps are generalized stages of collaborative landscape planning processes. These are an amalgamation of from commonly used process models such as strategic habitat conservation, systematic conservation planning, and the open standards for conservation. So it starts with conceptualizing the landscape planning initiative, like why are people being convened? What is the purpose of the overall group? And what is the organizational composition of the group? The next is establishing goals and objectives for the planning effort. Then it's followed by determining and developing planning products. What types of planning products and who will be the potential end users of these products. Then comes distributing the planning products and promoting their adoption. And then these are not always followed. Ideally, if you're using these planning processes are supposed to be iteratively adapted. And so if you're using an adaptive planning model, the use of planning products is then monitored, and the planning processes and products are then adapted based on changing social conditions, the needs of end users, feedback, whatever it may be.
Great. And kind of related to these 6 steps, going back to number 4, can you give examples, I guess, of other kind of planning products just to give everyone a sense for what that would include or could include?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So planning products can be anything from like really, really large scale environmental assessments, determining what types of habitat is in an area, from a broad perspective. It could be also habitat projections, how habitat and species distributions will change over time. It could be vulnerability assessments. Where are the most vulnerable areas and where are the most vulnerable species within a habitat? That might be vulnerability to anthropogenic impacts, such as urbanization, or it might be climatic. And also just decision support tools and management strategies, such as, recommended quotas for, take of species or removal of culverts. So there's a whole range of planning products that can be produced by these landscape initiatives. Oftentimes they're habitat prioritization or environmental prioritizations that show where there's connectivity between areas and where conservation should be prioritized.
Great. And then there's a question, where can folks get the guide when it is released? And I can sort of take that one. So once I get that email from you, Catherine, I can put it on our Connected Conservation Toolkit. So we'll post it there. And when did you expect that to be released, Catherine?
It should be available by in 2 weeks. It's due to the Fish and Wildlife Service at the end of this week. So it'll also be available on the Human Dimensions portal of the Fish and Wildlife Service, or I'm sorry, it's the HD.gov is the portal. It'll also be available there. And you can always contact me with any questions or any requests for the guide or anything like that.
Awesome. So here's another one. How does sustainability of human development and landscape use fit into the planning process?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is, like, one of the challenges that we encounter as a conservation community is a lot of times that you'll have like a kind of a community of practice that's mostly natural resource practitioners. But the reality is that really developing conservation goals that are sustainable in these social ecological landscapes requires collaboration with folks that have focus on economic and socio-demographic and cultural and political aspects of land use and resource management and use. So understanding how these changing conditions really requires actually engaging with folks with a more social orientation. And so, bringing folks that have perhaps, knowledge about the spread of urban environments, or might be economic development teams at a municipal or county level. Bringing those folks into the conversations can really start to impart insight. And then you can actually use, so there's also this great resource of participatory like GIS, participatory mapping. And so you're able to bring in these more social aspects of priority areas for conservation versus areas that are particularly valued, or areas that are potentially vulnerable to the spread of urban populations or population growth. You can start layering those on top of perhaps the species prioritizations or the habitat prioritizations to really understand what ultimately the feasibility of conservation will be, and to try to prioritize conservation not only where it's most ecologically impactful, but also sociopolitically feasible.
Great. Okay, so before we begin opening up the lines, if folks can put their phone on mute, that would be really helpful, unless you have a question to ask. But I'm going to slip a question in here real quick for you, Catherine.
Sure.
How did you from your interviews, did you come across any kind of best practices for working with key stakeholders with minimal capacity, but are key to success?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that's really important to understand, the barriers to participation and the limitations inherent to your end users. So if there's limited resources available to potentially really valuable end users, the best way to really help them is to either be a provider of resources, to partner with folks that can provide resources to those stakeholders, or to even just help stakeholders with logistical challenges like applying for grants. Like, not everybody, if you look at like land trusts, for example, land trusts can be really essential to resource and habitat conservation, but they don't always have the time or capacity to be iteratively applying for grants, especially if they're not like really organized land trusts. They're just more kind of community groups that, put some land aside in a municipality. So really providing that technical assistance is one of the most instrumental provisions of help that, that landscape conservation planning efforts can provide.
Great. All right, I'm going through the list, unmuting folks. Does anyone have a question? All right, I've got one more for you here while folks give it a thought. For that study that you were working with Fish and Wildlife Service on, are there, besides kind of these best practices, are there specific case studies that you look at or that will be described in it?
Absolutely. So the landscape conservation design efforts that I studied in depth I highlight examples throughout the guide. I provide guidance, and then I provide either a quote or like an insight into what I observed without, violating any kind of confidentiality. But there absolutely are explicit examples of how landscape initiatives have used social data and how they have encountered challenges as a result of not engaging local stakeholders, integrating social data. So there are absolutely explicit examples in the guide.
All right, here's another one that was plugged into the questions box. What type of facilitation, citizen engagement for public input do you prefer?
Well, the thing is, the most effective forms of public engagement tend to be in-person engagement events. These can help mollify historic conflicts between groups and really foster development of trust and relationships if they're effectively administered. This can be challenging, of course, because simultaneously engaging stakeholders throughout a landscape is really difficult. And so that's why it can be really instrumental to choose representatives who will be representing the interests and values of stakeholders during decision processes on a regular basis, but then can go back to their constituents or the folks that they represent and determine, make sure that what they're representing in these meetings is actually representing the interests of the groups that they're standing in for. Another really important event to kind of strategy to proceed with is before planning products have been determined, conducting needs assessments to really understand what are the realistic needs of your local stakeholders, what is going to be useful to them and what is not going to be useful to them. Because unfortunately, what I saw on a number of occasions were modelers and natural scientists going in and saying, this is what I want to create, so I'm going to create this. And then it was so technologically advanced and difficult. One of these models took 2 supercomputers 2 days to generate. And so not only is that really technologically difficult for the regular Joe who, runs a land trust to use, it's also really hard to iteratively adapt, because then you have to get that contract, if the contract ends, you basically don't have access to the people with the only knowledge of kind of the black box process associated with it. So really doing needs assessments and iteratively working with end users to determine what they need and whether and how the products are being used and how they can be adapted. And that might be in-person webinars, or it might be web-based, or it might even be solicitations through things like short surveys.
This is a related question. Sorry, go ahead. I think that was you, John.
John Dennis has another question. Conservationists often write about the humans who live in landscapes and the developments the humans are developing and the agricultural and forestal and mining practices they're conducting as threats. And my question is, how do you get as interested and participating stakeholders the people that are viewed as being threats?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So really facilitating participation by those potential detractors, the folks that are seen as threats, whether they be resource development or urban, like developers. You basically, there's various ways. So first of all, you can provide resources. So you can provide the legitimacy. You say, it's really legitimate that you're coming to plan with us. You're part of this community of practice. We're trying to be inclusive. You can provide actual incentives, such as access to granting opportunities. You can also, what's really strategic is try to focus on superordinate goals. Those are goals that are kind of above the current conflict and that are basic. So for example, clean water is a superordinate goal to kayakers, fisheries habitat folks, and to municipal water facilities. So if you can make planning purposes broad enough that the superordinate goals become apparent, and there's win-win solutions that really expose that participating can be beneficial to everybody, and really trying to reinforce the mutual interdependence and the fact that these folks, whether or not they like it, are really dependent on one another, can be really useful. So, and just to draw on an example, one person from an extractive industry I talked to out west said that they participate in landscape planning because they're basically fearful of regulation, right? So they're participating in these planning processes and being preemptive in their conservation practices will ultimately help them as a company, as an organization, not be further restricted from using natural resources. And so that's an incentive. Even like that fear of regulation can even be an intangible incentive. So, but focusing on tangible and intangible incentives and superordinate goals is probably one of the most strategic ways to go forward.
Thank you. I would advocate also that a really easy step for the conservation side of the house to take is to stop thinking of the human residents and developers as threats, but think of them more in the terms you were just identifying as partners in the overall higher level identification of common goals and working together to find ways to achieve those goals.
Absolutely, and that'll take organizational and cultural shifts, increasing valuation of social and the more local, but it's really necessary. One of the interesting things that we've observed as a community of practice in conservation is that community-based conservation was a really big phenomena, right? Starting in the 1980s with Eleanor Ostrom, like focusing on communities at conservation at that community base. And then we've got this challenge of you really have to manage resources from an ecological perspective at these broad landscapes. And so I guess the way forward for us as a conservation community is to figure out how we can integrate the values that we started to really focus on in community-based resource conservation and aggregate that up and bring some of those values that are socially oriented into the landscape level conservation world.
All right, here's another question that was in the put in the question box. Can you recommend any virtual town hall sort of online forums that could be used in addition to in-person meetings?
That's a good question. I haven't seen a ton of them because I've only really been exposed to like the WebEx and the GoToMeeting platforms, which are useful. I think that to the degree possible, having some kind of visual accountability is really useful. So if people sit in front of a monitor and they actually sit in front of something that's not recording them but visualizes them, because I think that everybody here maybe has been on FaceTime, and FaceTime is a much better kind of communication tool in a lot of ways than just regular phone communication. And it also could be participants could provide a picture of themselves if they're involved in serious meetings that they sign up for. They could provide a picture of themselves. Other ways to kind of make it a personal interaction as opposed to everybody just sitting on the phone and just staring at a monitor blankly and having no kind of personal communication and personal contact. But my technological skills are not super advanced, so I haven't dabbled in a lot of virtual meeting applications. So I'm sorry that answer is limitedly useful.
All right, here's another one. Could you go back to slide 1 or earlier in your slides where you had that CLC slide? that listed heritage areas and other collaborations on it. I think there was a lot there that a couple folks wanted to take a look at again.
Sure.
And I assume there's a lot of other efforts that would kind of, you could make a big list here of all similar efforts or programs. Yeah.
Well, one of the interesting things, like one of the things that I did in my dissertation was my dissertation not only sought to like develop practice, but it also sought to develop theory. And one of the problems that we see in the landscape community is that there are people that are, there are communities of practice that are biocentric, that are from the agricultural perspective, that look at agricultural integrated land management or look at cultural land management. And then there's the folks that are looking at the habitat and the resources. And a lot of times they're talking past each other. And so my dissertation paper is actually one of the papers, or multiple of the papers actually seek to develop this concept of collaborative landscape conservation, which is intended to focus on broad ecological areas and multiple resources, and it involves this collaborative landscape planning processes and the production of planning products that are intended to be adopted. And one of the biggest challenges that we see is that basically planning, the landscape planning process happens at a different spatial and institutional level than the management planning that they're intended to inform. And so the products of landscape planning are not themselves plans. They require adoption. And so that introduces all these interesting issues of problems of scale and issues of fit. And I'm not going to do this to you guys, but I could switch over to my dissertation presentation and show you a bit more kind of like slides about what I mean by that, but I won't belabor the point. But there are, the other thing is that landscape is a really malleable term, and landscape, one of the things that I did in my work was I developed this database of over 600 landscape initiatives in the United States that have been identified by the Center for Landscape Conservation, the Partners for Landscape, the Landscape Conservation Network, and other initiatives. And there are huge numbers of them, of these people that identify as landscape level. But that landscape could be anything from literally 5 counties in Pennsylvania, because they're under Dillon's law and each of the counties has basically regulatory authority, to international and transnational efforts. So there's a broad variability in the types of landscape initiatives that are out there.
Any other questions?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
I can.
All right. I'm just wondering if there might be any section or appendix or what have you, where there might be memorandums of agreement or cooperative agreements, more not the exchange of funds, but just how the groups will collaborate together. If there's anything in your guide to address that.
That's a really interesting question. It's something that my lawyer husband asked me the other day, actually. The thing is that I haven't actually dabbled into those more constructed partnership agreements, because a lot of the time these like collaborative arrangements are voluntary, and they're not always, you might have a memorandum of understanding with an agency that allows you to work with them, but it doesn't say that you're committed to a landscape planning process. So like, for example, you can be part of a steering committee for a landscape conservation cooperative, for example, and you're committed personally and your organization has approved your commitment. But if you were to abandon the agreement, it's not, or the process, it's not like you're going to be violating any contracts. Right. And so that's another complicated thing about the landscape conservation, is oftentimes they're really based on voluntary participation, and there aren't any formal agreements such as memorandums of understanding or those types of contracts.
I guess then the model would be who typically takes the lead and how do they operate would be the next follow-on question.
Yeah, that's also a good question and a complicated one, especially in the current environment that we're in. So, for example, I started my dissertation 5 years ago, and landscape conservation cooperatives were a $27 million project, right? That was funded by Fish and Wildlife, and now they're eliminated. Right, so they're only going to exist if the AFWAs, if the American Fish and Wildlife Associations want them, because there's an interest in decentralizing in this administration. And so the problem is that oftentimes the people that are most capable to administer and lead and fund these initiatives are at the federal level, but they're also the agencies that are most vulnerable to stochasticity and to changes in administrative priority. And so decentralizing responsibility for leadership and for funding to NGOs, for example, in this environment, to organizations that are still national level, such as Trust for Public Lands or the Nature Conservancy or the Wildlife Conservation Society, that's going to be really instrumental to fostering the sustainability and not putting all of our eggs in one basket that might be just cut out of a federal budget.
Okay, thank you.
Easier said than done, obviously, but
yeah, including funding.
Yes, absolutely funding.
Yeah, Catherine, Brian, I was thinking the same thoughts actually of the question you just got. I mean, are there any correlations or kind of a secret formula for the role of, funding and, public-private, the roles of public or private kind of driven initiatives? Are there any correlations between any of those, I guess, two variables in terms of success?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the most successful landscape initiatives that I have seen are the ones that are either grassroots or they directly address known and acknowledged local issues. So national heritage areas are some of the most successful landscape conservation initiatives out there, because this narrative of preserving your cultural heritage and your national heritage is something that really resonates with local communities, as you guys know. And it also, like, the national heritage areas really foster economic development and revitalization that's really valuable at a local level. And so figuring out what's really important to the local folks is really integral to sustainability, because even if federal programs, I mean, like, even the national heritage areas, for the model of the 15 years, when the federal government, after which the federal government is no longer intended to support financially these initiatives, and having them have to be decentralized in terms of administrative responsibility to these committees is a really important model, because just having it at the federal level is just not sustainable ultimately, because it's, for a variety of reasons, it's seen as top down, it's seen as oftentimes federal overreach, it's seen as whatever. Everybody around this country has different opinions about the federal government. But really finding ways to ensure that whatever the conservation initiative's focus is, it resonates and has value to local stakeholders is really integral. I talked to one fellow in NRCS who said that he has never seen a NRCS-funded project that is successful unless it addressed known local issues. And so, I mean, this is this challenge. Like, we as a scientific community want to make advancements regarding environmental assessments and spatial analyses, but if they don't address known and acknowledged local needs, they're not going to be useful and they're not going to be used, and they're going to be eventually either become obsolete or phased out, or just like experience these planning implementation gaps that are so ineffective and inefficient. I should just mention one landscape conservation design effort that I saw that was also really successful was one that was led by a local land trust collaborative. And so it derived funding from the landscape conservation cooperatives, but it was not run by any type of federal agency or even a major environmental group. It was more at a regional level. And they have been really successful because not only did they already have a community of practice and basically a network of collaborators that they could draw on, but it also has this local legitimacy, and people aren't fearful of it, and people aren't resentful of it in the same way that I've observed sometimes folks are when the federal, and I'm sorry, I know I'm talking to federal government. I love federal government. I want to work for the federal government. I'm not trying to bash the federal government, but you guys all know there's challenges of, working for the federal government and kind of the perception that, we're the government, we're here to help. And so trying to just really always try to seek to understand what the local priorities are is really the best way forward for sustaining these groups.
All right, any other questions for Catherine?
I would just make a comment that that the whole process is one that a program within the National Park Service has called the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program. And everything you're saying about locally driven, identifying the local issues and their concerns and their needs is really the whole core of the program too. So just not always on the large landscape level. It's a variety of different projects. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the the National Parks Program has been, in my observation, some of the most successful because they really do seek to understand, and they foster participation by local stakeholders. And the Park Service is one that has really institutionalized local stakeholders as a player in decision making. My understanding is that national heritage areas cannot be created unless there has been demonstrated public interest in them. And that's a great thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Biosphere reserves operate at the landscape scale, and could be another element you could put on the slide number 1. Have you looked at how biosphere reserves in theory function?
I haven't, because I focus mostly on North America, and I guess that maybe there are some biosphere reserves, but that's a really good question. I think that I haven't looked at them, and the interesting thing about biosphere reserves versus like landscape initiatives, for example, is that the potential stakeholders of biosphere reserves are so broad. They are the human population of the world, right? Because everybody benefits from the existence of those determined biospheres. And so their administration is even more complicated. But as I understand, they're more administered from the perspective of preservation and not necessarily using the habitats in the areas. But I could, of course, be wrong. I'm not super familiar with the program initiative.
They definitely focus on sustainable development as the core of their concern. And you could look at the Mammoth Cave Biosphere Reserve as a U.S. example. The U.S. currently has 29 that are trying to remain within the world network of biosphere reserves.
Look at my ignorance. Thank you so much for letting me know about this.
You could look at Mammoth Cave or Southern Appalachians or Golden Gate as examples.
Yes. I didn't realize that these were biosphere reserves. Well, thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
On that note, Catherine, I can put you in touch with John and Pat Mangan with the Park Service who are involved with that.
That would be terrific. Thank you.
All right. Any last questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
or follow up with me.
Or give Catherine an email or call later on. So it's not that severe, really.
And you can get me, I'm sure Brian can help you get my email, but it's very simple, CED97@Cornell, CORNELL.edu.
Great.
Or you could just look me up on the website and find my email address.
And also this for the Park Service folks, Catherine, once I get that report from you, I'll post it to our internal Park Service toolkit, and then I'll put I'll include your email in that posting on our toolkit. So again, folks, it'll be there for you if you as a resource. Okay, well, thanks so much, Catherine, and thanks everyone else for joining. Just as a reminder, our next webinar is July 10 at 3 Eastern Time, and it'll be our presenter is Joan Harn with RTCA, and she'll be presenting on the Wild and Scenic River System. So it should be a
Thank you for your time, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.